Why do today's moral debates so often feel like shouting matches where no one is listening? One person demands justice for the planet, another defends economic freedom, and the third argues for bodily autonomy. They all speak with passion. They all sound like they're making moral claims, that is. But if you listen closely, it's as if they're speaking different languages entirely. It's easy to feel like we're drowning in moral noise. Loud, urgent, and contradictory. And what's worse is that there seems to be no shared criteria for deciding who's right. It's not that we disagree, per se, it's that we no longer agree on what it means to argue about morality at all. The philosopher Alasdair MacIntyre saw this coming. In his book After Virtue, he argues that modern moral discourse is a wreck, not by accident, but because we lost something fundamental, a shared sense of purpose of what human life is for. Without that, he says, our moral arguments are like fragments of language we no longer fully understand. This video is about his diagnosis of the problem, and why his call to recover virtue might be more relevant now than ever. MacIntyre begins his explanation with a thought experiment. Imagine a world where all scientific knowledge has been wiped out by a catastrophe. People try to rebuild it, but all they have are scattered pieces. A few equations, parts of lab equipment, isolated words like neutrino or gravity. They imitate science, but without understanding its foundations. According to MacIntyre, this is exactly the state of modern morality. We use words like justice, duty, rights, and virtue, but we've lost the coherent framework that once gave them meaning. We're playing a game whose rules we no longer remember. He calls this condition emotivism, the idea that moral statements are really just expressions of personal preference or emotion. When someone says abortion is wrong or freedom must be protected, it may sound like they're making a rational argument, but according to emotivism, these are really just emotional declarations, such as I disapprove of abortion or I like freedom. No more binding than saying you prefer chocolate over vanilla. In a society shaped by emotivism, moral disagreement becomes impossible to resolve. Why? Well, because there's no shared standard to appeal to. You say justice, I say freedom, someone else says safety, but there's no deeper agreement about what those values mean, let alone how to rank them. We're left with moral debates that look like arguments, but function more like ideological standoffs. Alasdair writes,
what we possess, if this view is true, are the fragments of a conceptual scheme, parts which now lack those contexts from which their significance derived. We possess indeed simulacra of morality. We continue to use many of the key expressions. But we have, very largely, if not entirely, lost our comprehension, both theoretical and practical, or morality.
And this, says MacIntyre, is the true moral crisis of our time. Not that we disagree, but that we can't even argue properly anymore. So, how did we get here? Well, MacIntyre's answer is actually quite simple. The Enlightenment project failed. Not because it was badly executed, but because it was fundamentally flawed. During the Enlightenment, philosophers tried to rebuild morality on a new foundation, one that would no longer depend on religion, tradition, or teleology. The idea that human life has a natural purpose or goal. They wanted to create a system of ethics grounded purely in reason, universally valid and free from metaphysical baggage. MacIntyre argues that the Enlightenment was a response to a deeper rupture. The moral framework rooted in Aristotle and later Thomas Aquinas had been cast aside during the transition from medieval to modern world. So what followed was a desperate attempt to rebuild morality on a new secular foundation. But this Enlightenment project, he claims, failed.
It was because that project, the Enlightenment, failed. Because the views advanced by its most intellectually powerful protagonists, and more especially by Kant, could not be sustained in the face of rational criticism that Nietzsche and all his existentialist and emotivist successors were able to mount their apparently successful critique of all previous morality.
In other words, Nietzsche's radical moral skepticism isn't the source of our moral crisis, it's the symptom. His critique only gained power because the Enlightenment philosophers failed to secure the foundations they thought they were building. Here's the problem. If you strip morality of its historical and teleological context, you're left with rules floating in the void. You can still say "don't lie" or "maximize happiness", but why? What's the human good these rules are supposed to serve? The Enlightenment thinkers tried to answer that. Kant, Hume, Bentham, all in their own way, but without a shared vision of what it means to flourish as a human being, their systems couldn't hold together. I mean, imagine trying to play chess after forgetting the rules, but still insisting that certain moves are right or wrong. That's the modern moral landscape, according to MacIntyre at least. Formal arguments without a foundation, values without a vision. MacIntyre doesn't just diagnose our moral confusion in abstract terms, he also shows how it shapes the kinds of people our culture tends to produce. And so he offers 3 archetypes that embody life in a world where morality has lost its anchor. First, we have the manager. This is the person who treats everything, education, health, politics, as problems to be optimized. Efficiency is the highest value. Morality becomes a matter of technique, what works, what increases productivity, what produces measurable outcomes. But notice that the manager rarely asks why those outcomes matter. They're trained to achieve goals, not to question whether the goals are good. In MacIntyre's world, the manager is thus a symbol of technocratic thinking without ethical direction. Secondly, we have the therapist. The therapist helps individuals cope, adapt, and feel better, often by helping them adjust to the world as it is. Again, the deeper question is missing. Should we adjust? Is the world worth adapting to, or should we challenge it? Therapy becomes a way of smoothing over existential pain, without confronting its causes. The therapist thus symbolizes a culture that prioritizes emotional well-being over moral integrity. Thirdly, we have the aestheticist. When morality feels hollow and systems seem unworthy, what's left? Well, self-expression. The aestheticist approaches life as a work of art, crafting an identity, pursuing novelty, rejecting external standards. This figure is not necessarily selfish, but they are adrift. Without this shared moral framework, all that remains is personal taste. The aestheticist becomes a free-floating self, untethered from anything beyond themselves. These characters are not villains, they're us. They reflect how we try to live meaningful lives in a world where the moral foundation has already crumbled. Each one offers something real, but without a shared vision of human purpose, their efforts remain fragmented. If the modern moral landscape is fragmented, MacIntyre's solution is not to invent a brand new ethical system. Instead, he calls for the recovery of a more ancient vision of moral life, one rooted in virtue, narrative, and tradition. At the center of that recovery is the idea of practice. MacIntyre provides a very detailed definition for this, because he uses it in a special way.
By a practice, I'm going to mean any coherent and complex form of socially established, cooperative human activity through which goods internal to that form of activity are realized in the course of trying to achieve those standards of excellence which are appropriate to and partially definitive of that form of activity, with the result that human powers to achieve excellence and human conceptions of the ends and goods involved are systematically extended.
Yeah, this definition is dense, but powerful and precise. A practice is thus, firstly, cooperative and social. It can't be done alone, it lives in communities. It is also historically and structurally complex. It has evolved standards and forms. Thirdly, it is morally formative. Engaging in it develops your capacity to excel and deepens your understanding of what is good. Think of disciplines like classical music, architecture, medicine, or democratic debate. These aren't just skill sets, they're traditions of excellence. They have internal goods, like the expressive power of a sonata, or the integrity of just legal ruling, that can only be pursued by submitting to the standards of the practice and learning from those more experienced. And because these internal goods matter, virtues become necessary. To genuinely participate in a practice, you need honesty, perseverance, justice, and humility. External goods like money, recognition, or power must be subordinated to the internal aims of the activity, or the practice begins to decay. Okay, great, but practices don't exist in a vacuum either. We also need narrative unity, a sense that our lives form a coherent story. Who am I becoming through these practices? What kind of life am I trying to live? Without this, moral decisions become isolated episodes rather than chapters in a meaningful life. And finally, we need tradition. Not as a rigid dogma, but as a living context that carries forward standards of excellence and makes practices intelligible. So in MacIntyre's view, tradition provides the moral grammar, if you will, for making sense of both our actions and our aims. In short, MacIntyre's vision is a call to rebuild morality, not from abstract theory, but from the ground up, through practice, story, and shared human ends. We live in a world of intense moral debate, but shallow moral agreement. We argue constantly about justice, freedom, and rights, but we've forgotten how to ask the deeper questions. What is a good life? What kind of people should we become? And without those questions, our moral vocabulary collapses into noise. MacIntyre's answer isn't simple, and it isn't quick. He doesn't offer a new ideology or a 12-step plan to fix society. Instead, he invites us to rebuild from the ground up by recovering the role of virtue, rerouting ourselves in the meaningful practices, and learning to see our lives as part of an unfolding story. Okay, so what can you do as an individual though? Well, you don't have to join a monastery or read Aristotle in Greek, but you can seek out practices that form character, not just produce outcomes. You can invest in communities that pursue excellence, not just efficiency. And you can begin to ask, not just what works or what feels right, but what kind of person this action is making you into. That, in the end, is MacIntyre's real challenge. To live not just with values, but toward something. Toward the kind of life that makes moral sense again. Thank you for watching. See you next time.
What matters at this stage is the construction of local forms of community within which civility and the intellectual and moral life can be sustained through the new dark ages which are already upon us. And if the tradition of the virtues was able to survive the horrors of the last dark ages, we are not entirely without grounds for hope.